Kia ora, my name is Vicki Kerr and welcome to our presentation. In response to the provocation, how do birds and humans communicate with each other and what we might learn from such an exchange, this paper discusses the artistic collaboration between musician Matthew Bannister and myself, exploring relationships embedded in shared environments, reimagined by musician and visual artist. As we move into what has been proposed as a new geological epoch referred to as the Anthropocene, we ask how we might imagine the relationship between humans and birds anew. Since the early 2000s, scientists have considered renaming our current geological era the Anthropocene, a proposed new geological epoch recognising the profound impact of human activity upon the Earth's crust and atmosphere. According to their argument, humanity now equates with forces such as volcanoes, glaciers and meteors that physically alter layers of rock. Biogeophysical evidence supporting the concept of the Anthropocene include increasing global average temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations, rising sea levels and ocean acidification, biodiversity loss leading to mass extinction, and the ubiquity of microplastics in terrestrial and marine ecosystems. While geologists and Earth system scientists continue to debate when the Anthropocene may have begun, philosopher Donna Haraway calls for resisting the term Anthropocene because it centres the anthropos, man, as if the multiple crises and destructions that merit the term were a species act done by virtue of being human as opposed to being in situated historical processes rooted in systems of wealth creation and the emergence of capitalism. Instead, Haraway has invented another word, Cthulhucene, which breaks down the hierarchy between the human and non-human worlds. Cthulhucene is a compound of two Greek roots, chthon and kainos, that together name a kind of time-place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth. Kainos means now, a time of beginnings, a time for ongoing, for freshness. In her book, Staying with the Trouble-Making Kin in the Cthulhucene, Haraway asks us to consider who we are bound up with and in what ways, arguing that we need to make new knots in those webs, new ways to bound into relationships that matter. This is where art plays a role. It is one of the means that we have for making significant bonds between ourselves and the prospects of other critters. It is, in the forms that Haraway describes, a mode of response-able thinking and acting. In this mode, art is a means to delve deeper into the specific modes of relation that science describes and studies. When it comes to the degradation of ocean ecosystems and the threat to marine species, it is migratory seabirds acting as environmental sentinels that this paper will focus on. As a major conduit between marine and terrestrial systems, seabirds carry the nutrients they consume at sea into the forests where they breed. Their health and reproductive success provides early warning signals of deteriorating marine ecosystems as the climate changes and fish stocks decrease. Aotearoa, New Zealand is the seabird capital of the world, with 95% of all species breeding here and 10% exclusively so. They play a critical role in maintaining healthy ecosystems, including supporting Aotearoa's forests that have been long dependent on marine nutrients to support their growth. In recognising a seabird's environment as defined by its sensory capabilities, how might we learn to communicate and cooperate with these overlooked taonga through creative practice? Haraway's notion of making kin, that is, requiring each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations, comes to mind, where we become with each other or not at all. How might we imagine the relationship between humans and birds anew, beside them as kin? As an artist, I believe art can play an important role in cultivating the conditions for ongoingness through renewed relationships, entangling us in the life of others, and drawing us into deeper understandings of responsibility, reparative possibilities, and livable futures in an unfolding, changing, mobile world. A characteristic of our current relation to seabirds and their familiar sounds is their growing unavailability in an age when the unprecedented global movement and planetary spread of the human population has culminated in unsustainable fishing, predators, and widespread habitat destruction. Speculating upon avian communication and what birds can tell us, musician Matthew Bannister and I, a visual artist, are currently collaborating on a multimedia artwork exploring how sound and listening attaches us to one another and to our environments, along with ways in which these attachments are woven. Taking our cue from seabirds sharing our local environment on the west coast of Aotearoa's North Island, Matthew and I have turned our attention to a range of seabirds, from the petrel through to the gannet, using bird sounds in an electroacoustic music genre known as musique concrete, a style of music constructed from mixed recorded sounds. Musique concrete involves the use of everyday sounds as musical material, with the objective of apprehending sounds in isolation from the source of that sound. Working on the premise that bird vocalization is a performed negotiation in defence of territory, mate attraction and contact maintenance between pairs and groups, a bird's call is a form of communication that effectively says "come here" or "go away," which one could also argue is true of music. It marks a social space and time and invites others or repels them. Some hear music, some hear noise. Rather than limiting bird calls to functionless categories of explanation, we ask whether seabirds can communicate with each other at a far more granular level, exchanging information about environmental changes using a malleable vocabulary comprised of unique acoustic units which can be arranged and rearranged sequentially for greater communicative depth. Granting a high level of agency and creativity to birds, as opposed to believing a bird only avails itself of stereotyped speech to survive an accident-rich environment, places greater importance on responses that are improvised directly upon the environmental stimuli as irritant rather than as a signal. Sampling found recordings of seabirds, our musique concrete uses a type of granular processing that chops and reorders sound in the time domain using time stretching. This technique provides a way to analyse or experience the inner timbre of a seabird vocalisation and the rhythmic patterns of their calls. As a result, sound samples are composed through the voice of the seabird, becoming a human response to the other in jointly formed compositions, a collective voice reflecting a living, evolving relationship between composer/performer and the bird. Now, in the next slide, you're going to hear an example from one of our sound samples of a gannet call. The history of sampling can be traced to Pierre Schaffer, an engineer, writer, composer and acoustician who pioneered musique concrete. According to Schaffer, the word concrete did not designate a source. It meant that we were apprehending all the characteristics of a sound in its totality. Now, this allowed sound to be apprehended as though it were an object, enabling the listener to consider it in itself as being in itself, divorced from the relational world of language and consciousness. According to Schaffer, to accept the objet sonore, we should listen acoustematically, a term borrowed from Pythagoras, as a sound that one hears without seeing the causes behind it. In our work, we are experimenting with sampling as a way of decontextualising sounds, in this case birds, manipulating them to construct sound objects with new possibilities of meaning. But contra Schaffer, sampling can also be heard as a tribute or acknowledgement of the source. It works both as a reference, but once manipulated, as raw material for new soundscapes. Repetition is a key technique as it tends to excite a bodily or musical response rather than an intellectual or linguistic one. These sound objects are accepted for their sonic, acoustic properties, for their texture, grain, for all the qualities they carry in excess of or prior to traditional music values. The effect upon the listener is experienced as a bodily, sensual, as opposed to an emotive event whose transmission to the listener is direct and material rather than cerebral and abstract. Circling back to the territorial go-away, come-here binary, social theorist Jacques Attali claims that all music, any organisation of sounds, is a tool for the creation or consolidation of a community, of a totality. It is what links a power centre to its subjects, and thus more generally, it is an attribute of power in all its forms. Bird calls are a tool for marking territorial boundaries, inscribed from the start within the panoply of power. Equivalent to the articulation of a space, it indicates the limits of a territory and the way to make oneself heard within it, and how to survive by drawing one's sustenance from it. A key idea we have discovered using sampling is that repetition can transform noise into music, as it can also transform language into music. In light of this, we think bird calls are best described not in terms of noise, but in terms of a kind of oral communication that conflates the functions of language and music.